Welcome to this week's episode of Seeking Proof, Finding Grace. I'm your host, Ron Campbell, and this week, as with every week, I want to start off by reminding you of the most important truth in the entire universe. God loves you. Don't ever miss that. That is the most important truth in the entire universe. And when you catch that point, it'll change your life. Now, we have been going through, we've just completed an 8-week study looking at what happened between the two most critical dates, probably, in the ancient timeline as it relates to our topic, 33 AD, which is the most probable date, one of the most probable dates of when Jesus dies, is buried and raised from the dead, and then 70 AD when Jerusalem falls. And I've made the case that the best answer on the table is that the Gospels themselves began to be committed to writing in the 50s. And please see those episodes for more discussion on that topic. I'll admit it's a bit of an aggressive timing, but I think there's good reason to look at that and begin to drop all of those things in accordingly. The question that we're going to keep running up against is so much of what has soaked into our culture are the ideas of the form critics from over 100 years ago. You'll see people online, a lot of skeptics, Bart Ehrman especially. You will see people online who have just soaked up the ideas of the form critics, and these ideas are largely out of date. These ideas have been increasingly rejected by modern scholarship. And it's time to look at this stuff with a little bit more critical eye and maybe a little bit less of a skeptical eye in all of this. It's good reason to be critical of the data and to look at it and really test it and see what it says. But what you don't want to be is pessimistic about the data or overly skeptical to the point of being cynical about the data. And there are assumptions that you make as it relates to the form critics that have just been accepted over the years, that have been slowly dying away over time, but that still live online and still live in a lot of the critics, the agnostic and atheist critics and skeptics out there. These ideas that the Gospels themselves were written very late, in many cases well into the 2nd century, that we don't know who wrote them and things like that, requires assumptions that are just not valid when we really boil them down. Now, I'm going to be quoting a lot tonight. I've quoted a couple times already from Richard Bauckham's book, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses. This is a fantastic read. I would recommend it to anybody. And Bauckham does multiple things within this text. What he's going after is, number one, he really does a good job of addressing why the form critics' ideas were wrong. One of the things he puts out there in all of this, the assumptions of the form critics on how things were passed on in an oral tradition. This statement's really pretty good. It says, the Gospels are unreliable sources for the history of Jesus, not merely because of the fallibility of human memories, but more decisively because the Christian communities had no real interest in preserving traditions about the past, but formulated Jesus' traditions for quite the different purpose of witnessing to the present living Lord Jesus. And so, again, that point being that, they took old stories that were, and they kind of turned them into something Jesus style. You see a lot of progressives doing this today, where they'll basically take Jesus and mold him into whatever they want him to be. And that's what the form critics ultimately were suggesting 100 years ago, is that really these communities had no real interest in protecting the truth about who Jesus was. They just kind of took the character of Jesus and they just kind of molded him into whatever they wanted to do. And what you're going to find is that doesn't hold up at all to the recorded history that we see coming out of the book of Acts, but it also just doesn't make any sense. This was the most important thing to them, and we know that because of the persecution that they faced. Everybody can believe whatever weird ideas that they get online these days, and there's really no consequences to it. There's lots of weird ideas out there on the internet these days. But when you stepped up as a Christian in many of these communities in the late 1st century, the price you paid was just horrific, sometimes up and into the loss of your life. And so for these people, it doesn't make any sense to say, Well, I mean, they just basically took this Jesus character and did whatever they wanted with him. They were willing to die for what they believed was the truth. And the question is, how did they receive that message? What did it look like? And so this week, what we want to do is talk about, based on modern day evidence, based on what we're seeing today, what is the most likely explanation for how these stories would have been passed on. And then over the next couple of weeks, we're going to look at, well, what does the New Testament actually say about it? Does the book of Acts, do the letters of Paul give us any indication of, well, how were these messages passed on? What did that look like as it went forward? This is quoting from Vincent Taylor. It says, if the form critics are right, the disciples must have been translated to heaven immediately after the resurrection. In other words, the disciples themselves must have had absolutely nothing to do with spreading the message, which runs contrary to everything that we actually know. And that's what we're going to be looking at as we go forward. So as we look at this and talk about it, what we want to do this week is really look at this question. Does what the form critics suggest make any sense whatsoever as we talk about all of this? So let's start with that. What was it the form critics based their ideas on? And then let's talk about what modern scholarship actually sees as a much more likely answer. So putting this out there again, this quoting from Bauckham's book says, the assumptions of the comparability with folklore. And again, the form critics like to compare the Gospels, how they were passed on, with like folk stories. So it's like Hansel and Gretel or something like that. I mean, it was just kind of passed on and everybody could put their own spin on it and you do with it whatever you want. The assumption of the comparability with folklore, freely altered and created in transmission, can be questioned at several points. The time span between Jesus and the Gospels is much shorter than the periods of time spanned by the tradition studied by folklorists. We've talked about that over the last 8 weeks. Moreover, the nature of the traditions is very different. If the analogy with oral traditions in traditional societies is to carry any weight, there must be more careful distinction between different types of traditions and the different ways in which they are treated. I mean, that makes absolute sense. It's going to be totally different if I'm telling a tall tale about a trip that my family took to Disney World versus if I'm telling the story of my mom and dad's wedding, an actual historical event that has enormous meaning and importance to my family. There's a difference in how those two stories are going to be passed on. So when you look at that, it makes perfect sense. Virtually every element in this construction has been questioned, this is the form critics' idea, and rejected by some or even most scholars. Many of these criticisms are rooted in the much better and fuller information that is now available about the way oral traditions operate in predominantly oral societies. So what he's saying is, we know so much more today than we did 100 years ago about how these stories, how history is passed on, that it's time we took a look at this and revised what the form critics put out there all that long ago. The other place in all this, and I think this is a really good point, there's very good reason to believe it wasn't just all passed on orally between the time Jesus died and the time the Gospels were committed to writing. It says here, the Gospel traditions were transmitted purely orally for several decades. That the Gospel traditions, were transmitted purely orally for several decades was assumed by the form critics rather than demonstrated. The world of the early Christian communities was not a purely oral one, but a predominantly oral society in which written text had a place that was closely related to orality. We actually have a moment in 2 Timothy where Paul betrays that fact, that he's looking for certain parchments for Timothy to bring to him. And it would beg the question, well, why would you be looking for them if they weren't important documents? Probably of how he was witnessing and spreading the gospel message. So what did it really look like? What was it really more like now that we're looking back on it with a much better sense of history and culture and things like that? I love this quote. He says, the fact that these informants, people spreading the message, whether the 12 or the other disciples, were not the only eyewitnesses, but also prominent teachers in the early Christian movement shows, in coherence with what we have learned from Papias, one of the church fathers, that they did not merely start their tradition going and then withdraw from view, but remain for many years the known sources and guarantors of the traditions of traditions of the deeds and words of Jesus. And we see that from the book of Acts. We're going to talk about that in the upcoming weeks. The fact that the disciples were out there as the guarantors of this is recorded for us throughout the book of Acts over and over and over again. And it's amazing that we've ignored it in the form critics' theories. But I want to quote from Bauckham, and he brings in a really good article by a New Testament scholar named Kenneth Bailey, who has more than 30 years experience in the Middle East discussing how oral traditions are passed on in these current cultures and looking back on what was a much more likely method of how they were transmitted years ago. Now, Bailey identifies 3 different methods, and I think these make sense when you think about them, about how things are passed on in an oral tradition. Number 1 is informal and uncontrolled. So that's going to be sitting around the campfire, telling tall tales. There's no real emphasis on getting it right because half of the fun of the story is embellishing what all went on. You know, this idea of informal and uncontrolled, I go back to a trip that my wife and I took to Tokyo. You know, we had practiced up ahead of time. We were going to be 11 days in Tokyo, and I really wanted to not embarrass myself with a pair of chopsticks. I'm okay with chopsticks, but I'm not great. And so we had practiced a little bit before we went. And the second or third night of the trip, second night of our trip, we had reservations at a very nice restaurant. We go to sit down, and they brought out, it was a hibachi restaurant. And so they bring out Wagyu beef that they've cooked really very well. But the chunks of beef are pretty good size, bigger than I would normally have expected. Now, with a fork and a knife, I'm going to be in great shape. But I have a pair of chopsticks. And as I go to take a bite, the chopsticks twist on me. And that piece of beef goes flinging up into the air and lands in my lap. And our hosts and one of the waitresses, to their credit, come running to my rescue with an extra napkin, because napkins are not exactly something that you find a lot in Tokyo. They're more like wet wipes. But they come running over with an extra wet wipe, and the maitre d' comes running over with a fork. And at that point, they hand me a fork, and my humiliation is complete at that point in my life. Now, what's funny is that story immediately made it back to our family, despite the 14-hour time difference or something like that. By the end of the next day, my entire family knew that story, and by 2 days later, our entire friend group knew that story. And the more that story gets told, there's really not a lot of motivation to keep it accurate. It became a tall tale very quickly. But it's a funny story, and I get it, and there's no real harm either way. It's, the idea of, humiliating the recipient, which was me. But that's one idea of informal and uncontrolled, okay? So there's really no motivation to get the story right, although it's embarrassing enough on its own, so maybe you could argue that it is. The second method is formal and controlled. Now, formal and controlled is very straightforward. There's an identified teacher and an identified student. This is extremely common today, but it was also extremely common 2,000 years ago. 2,000 years ago, if you were a Pharisee, like Paul was, you had to memorize word for word the first 5 books of what we call the Old Testament today. Word for word. So you would have had a teacher, and you would have a specifically defined teacher and a specifically defined student, and you would have learned that information word for word. That's a tall order, and that's a big deal going into that. You also see people doing that with the Quran today and other documents still, where people memorize these things word for word. That's not what we're talking about here. What we're talking about here is informal, controlled. And that would be the third category that he breaks out. And what he says is, the traditional setting is the gathering of villagers in the evening for the telling of stories and the recitation of poetry. These gatherings have a name. They are called, I'm going to mess this up, so forgive me, the Haflat Samar. Samar in Arabic is a cognitive of the Hebrew shamar, meaning to preserve. Isn't that interesting? The community is preserving its store of tradition. By informal, we mean that there is no set teacher and no specifically identified student. It's everybody sitting around a campfire, but it's different. As stories, poems, and other traditional materials are told and recited through the evening, anyone can theoretically participate. That's important. In fact, the older men, the more gifted men, and the socially more prominent men tend to do the reciting. the reciters will shift depending on who is seated in the circle. I have often been seated, this is again Kenneth Bailey, I've often been seated in such circles when some piece of traditional oral literature is quoted. I might not happen to know the story and so proceed to ask what it's all about. Then someone says, Elder so-and-so knows the story. The ranking social/intellectual figure then proceeds to tell the story with pride. That makes a lot more sense in terms of what we're talking about. This is historical material. It's material of enormous importance. It's not an embarrassing story of some guy making a fool of himself in a hibachi restaurant. It's an incredibly important story, and so it's going to be told by somebody who has credibility, who knows the information, and so it's going to be passed on in a controlled manner. Just logically, that makes way more sense than the other ideas that have been put out there. Bauckham goes on to talk about how these stories are passed on and the differences in terms of how they flow. What's allowed to be changed and what's allowed to be altered and changed is very little. You can use some different inflections with some of the words. You might be able to change the order in which some of the events, the minor events occurred. But generally speaking, you have to stay dead on with the material so that this material isn't altered in the transmission. They protect the truth of such things very seriously. Why would they do that? Because it's important. This is history. This is important. We try to do the same thing with our history. We try to pass these things on so that the information is maintained from generation to generation to generation, and so that it's not lost. That makes much more sense than what the form critics told us would have happened several thousand years ago. And what we see is, as modern New Testament theologians and scholars look at this, the ideas of the form critics just don't fit with, number one, the importance of the message, and number two, what we know. And as the date from the time that Jesus died to the time that those New Testament documents were written continues to shrink, what we see is that the likelihood of the original eyewitnesses being involved not only becomes possible, it becomes very likely. And that's what we're going to see in the next couple of episodes. Who were the people? Who were the people who were telling these stories, and what evidence do we have? We're going to spend quite a few weeks talking about that, and it's fascinating to look at because the answer, ironically, is right there in Scripture in a lot of cases. And a lot of times we just have kind of looked past it in the past. I think that's a good place to stop. So tonight we're going to go ahead and stop there. Thank you so much for joining me. I hope you've enjoyed the episode. If you have, I hope you'll consider hitting the like button for the episode and the subscribe button for the podcast. You can reach out to us with questions at prooftokrace@yahoo.com for emails. You can find helpful information on our website at prooftokrace.com, and you can find our podcasts on iTunes, Spotify, and YouTube. I want to thank you so much for joining me, and I hope to see you next week as we continue to study who were the people who were passing this on and what do we know about them. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you next time.